If you see a 9-9, Olga Korbut's won a gold medal. There it is.
5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
You're listening to a podcast from Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, an online archive series showcasing the work of expert historians. I'm Vince Hunt and I'll be hosting the series. If you like these shows, please share them with your friends and colleagues and rate and review us on iTunes. It really helps new listeners find us. Dr. Jutta Braun is head of the Centre for Sports History in Berlin and a researcher in the Centre for Contemporary History in Potsdam. Her expertise is in Germany during the Cold War and how sport became an arena of political struggle. And East Germany is a classic example of that, Jutta, isn't it?
East Germany was in the midst of the political struggle, and there was a wall going through Berlin, dividing the country. But the wall also existed in the heads and in all fields of culture, especially in sports, because the GDR regarded sport as a perfect arena of success and of demonstrating a separate identity and of demonstrating the superiority of the socialist system. And so they were very eager to come ahead of the FRG in the Olympic movement.
FRG being the Federal Republic of Germany, and of course the two countries were divided most significantly, most noticeably by Checkpoint Charlie, and the tensions between East and West Germany were perhaps best symbolised by that picture of the tanks facing each other, Soviet and Western tanks facing each other across Checkpoint Charlie. It was a difficult place to live in the late 50s, wasn't it, Berlin?
It was a very difficult place to live, especially for people in West Berlin who were cut off from West Germany and who tried to survive in this island city, in this front city. And of course also the sport relations of the city were hindered by the Soviet Union.
What was life like for normal people in both West and East Germany? How did they engage with sport, for example?
People from West Berlin could no longer play with people from East Berlin, so long-standing friendships and even clubs that had spectators and fans from both parts of the city were suddenly isolated from their original fans.
And they were really two separate countries, two separate blocks. There was no competition between the two in say, a German national league with teams from east to west. The separation was profound.
The separation was profound. From 1956 to 1964, the two Germanys were forced to start in a joint Olympic team. This was an order by the IOC to solve the German problem. But both sides were not very happy with the solution. It was an endless quarreling about all kinds of matters. So in 1968, the IOC said, okay, the GDR is allowed to start separately. And from that point on, the GDR wanted to be better than the FRG, and already in the Summer Games in 1968 they succeeded. They came in medal rank in place 5, and the FRG was only in the place 8. And the interesting thing is, ever since the Games in Mexico City in 1968, the GDR managed to be better than the FRG in every Olympic meeting, be it Summer Games, be it Winter Games. And in 1976, in Montreal, the Olympics in Montreal, the GDR even managed to come ahead of the United States of America. As a small country with only 17 million inhabitants, they proved to be better than the United States. You have to think what that means. And in 1984, in Sarajevo, they even managed to beat the big brother Soviet Union, which was not an occasion of boundless pleasure for the big brother. And one of the most important games, of course, have been the games in Munich in 1972, because this competition was held in West Germany, and it was the declared aim of the GDR to beat the class enemy on its own territory. And they did. They came in third, and the West Germans had to be satisfied with the fourth place in the medal table.
Just focusing on that period between 56 and 64, how on earth could West Germany and East Germany have a combined team when there was a big wall going through the middle of Berlin?
Yes, in the beginning in 1956, things were complicated but not so hard. But after the building of the wall in 1961, the games that took place in 1964, of course, were very hard to manage for both sides in this German team, as politics told them that they represented completely different ideologies, two separate parts of the country. Of course, they were talking in the same language, and of course, many of them knew each other. But the Cold War line, the Iron Curtain, was going directly through this team, and you couldn't ignore that. And because of this, a lot of quarrels were accompanying this united German team. There were fights about who was allowed to start. There were fights about athletes who had defected from the east to the west and now wanted to start in the western part of the joint team. And of course, the GDR would not allow that. And so there was a constant fight over little and big things, so that in the end, it was no longer possible to stick to this idea.
You mentioned defections, and high-profile athletic defections would attract a lot of publicity. Were there any big examples?
Yes, there have been many big examples in all types of sports, be it footballer, cyclists, or swimmer, or athletes from track and field, like, for example, Manfred Steinbach, Jürgen May, Falco Götz. These athletes defected from the GDR, and the East German state and the Communist Party treated them as traitors, as tracksuit traitors, like they called it in their internal files, because the GDR regarded its athletes as diplomats in a tracksuit. They should represent the country and the socialist ideal, and they had to be idols for the people in an ideological way, and in a political way, and in a social way. And if those role models chose to defect to the class enemy, this was a huge image disaster for the regime. And so the GDR tried to prevent them from getting away, but they did not always succeed. And the athletes used all conceivable ways. For example, a very prominent case is that of swimmer Axel Mittbauer, who used his own type of sport to escape from East Germany. He ran into the Baltic Sea and was swimming 22 kilometers to Lübeck, where he was fished out of the water by a West German boat. Well, he was lucky. But this, of course, was always a big thing for the press. In West Germany, he was celebrated as a hero in an athletic and in a political way. And the East German propaganda would make him a traitor, would call him a traitor. Other athletes like Jürgen May escaped via Hungary, hidden in a car. Or many used the occasion of Olympic Games or other international competitions to sneak out of the training camp and get away. For example, the East German gymnast Wolfgang Thüne wanted to defect at the occasion of a world championship in Bern in Switzerland. And he didn't know how, because he knew no one. And he was asking his West German colleague Eberhard Ginger, who was world champion back then, to help him. He asked him in the men's washing room, And he spontaneously helped him and put him in his car and drove him over the border to West Germany. And they never talked about this occasion because Eberhard Ginger at that time, it happened in 1974, Ginger at that time expected that he would at some day start in Moscow, maybe at the Olympics. And he would have never been allowed to do that if the communist bloc knew that he had helped someone who wanted to get away from the GDR. Of course, many footballers used the occasion of international matches to stay away from the GDR. And until today, it is very unclear what happened to Lutz Eigendorf, a very prominent footballer of the GDR, who defected, I think, 1979, and was killed in a car accident in 1983. And there are some hints in the Stasi files that the Ministry of State Security might have its hands and its fingers in this accident, but you can't prove it. But what we know is that the regime made use of this accident. They told their athletes, look at Mr. Eigendorf, you see what happened. We are everywhere. You don't have to think that you are safe the moment you have crossed the border. We will follow you. And this was indeed the case. When those people who fled the GDR opened their Stasi files after the fall of the wall, when the Stasi files were opened, many of them had to realize that the Stasi had followed them all the way into their new cities, into their new homes, had made photos of their car, of their girlfriend, of their home, had kept an eye on them. And yes, I think they have been lucky that not something more serious happened.
For the GDR, athletes on an international level would be something of a security risk. But how do you defend against somebody just deciding to jump in a car and head for the border?
The GDR worked on that problem. And the consequence was that the Ministry of State Security grew and grew and grew. And the athletes were not only monitored while being in the training camp or on the track and field training place, but they were monitored in their private life. Their homes were screened, and the Stasi always tried to find some hidden contacts to the West. It was sort of a trauma, a nightmare for the party leadership. And at least 2 or 3 athletes were sort of driven out of the GDR because of this grip of the Stasi. They did not want to go because they were not satisfied with life in the GDR, but they could no longer stand this day and night surveillance by the Ministry of State Security. So it was a self-fulfilling thing in the end.
Any mention of the GDR and the Cold War brings around the subject of doping.
Yes, as we all know, doping is an international problem, but East Germany proved to be very perfect. Also, in this respect, it was a state-organized doping, and it was, in many respects, forced doping. Many athletes, especially very young athletes, 12, 13, 14 years old, did not know at all that they were getting doping substances. They were told these are vitamins. Even older athletes were misguided, and so this whole system was not only a question of sport betrayal or sport fraud, but it was also an example of physical violence. And because of this, many sport officials of the former GDR and also sport doctors and sport coaches have been sentenced in the so-called Moabit trials. They have been sentenced to financial penalties or to prison on probation because they had harmed so many people. And you had as evidence the many written documents of the Staatssicherheit, of the Ministry of State Security. In this case, it turned out to be very good that the Ministry of State Security had been so correct and so detailed when monitoring everything. It also monitored the doping complex. And of course, you had the evidence of the victims who told their story, the harm that was done to them. And many of them are very ill until today.
What drugs were they given and how has it affected them?
Of course, anabolics were very widespread at that time, not only in the East, but especially there. And you can get a lot of things like liver cancer or heart disease, problems with your blood circulation, psychological phenomena like depression and something like that. Children who are not healthy. Defects have been passed on to children. And this all had to be taken into account when these officials were sentenced at the end of the 90s.
That's another legacy of the Cold War.
Yes, it's a legacy of the Cold War, and it's an awful legacy, but in a way it has its positive side, because the insight into the horror of the East German doping system led to a moral outrage regarding the whole doping complex, which is extraordinary in Germany, and which triggered a broader discussion about doping. And for example, two former athletes of the GDR, Ines Geipel and Gesine Tettenborn, officially said that they want wipe away their former world records from GDR times from the year 1984 because it were tainted records. And they don't want that the youth is looking at unrealistic highs because, for example, the record of Ines Geipel is valid until today from the year 1984. So you can imagine the effect that the substances had. And they asked the Sports Federation to delete this record from the now all-German sporting annals. But the federation was very half-hearted. They deleted the names and put a little star in the place, but the record itself remained untouched. So it's the logic of higher, faster, better that is, of course, still intact everywhere. But doping has become more scandalized than it has ever been in the 70s or in the 80s. And I think a good part of the discussion that we have today, for example, about Russia, stems from the East German experience. In Germany, the doping that recently came to light regarding Russia is very often compared to the East German doping system. And of course, in Russia or other Eastern European states, you have never had this input of coming to terms with the past as you had it in Germany. In Germany, it was easier because the two states came together and people were encouraged to speak out. I think maybe in Russia or in other Eastern European states, there is a stronger national tradition to not talk about the secrets of the past.
One of the outcomes of the Cold War was the unification of Germany. And in a way, you've been able to come to terms with the Cold War in Germany and all its particular manifestations, such as the wall and the defections and etc., etc. How has Germany managed to reconcile this Cold War history?
I think it's still struggling with this big challenge to come to terms with the past, because it has so many different aspects. There is this huge problem of former entanglement with the Ministry of State Security. There are many athletes or coaches or sports officials who had contacts with the state security, and they are not proud of it. But they say we want to have a proper position in today's sport. In 25 years after unification, this must be possible. But the victims say, no, you don't have to have a top position in sports. You should do something else. So there is a fierce struggle about the so-called Stasi past and the human damage that was done by this intelligence service. And the other big complex is, of course, doping, because many of the villains have been sentenced have been taken to the court. But there is still maybe a mentality that says, well, the East German doctors and coaches did the same like the rest of the world did. And it is very hard to explain that this was doping under special condition, that this was doping in a dictatorship, that the athletes did not all agree to it. Some of them did, but not all of them, and surely not the children. You always have to keep in mind these circumstances. In today's discussion, this is not always taken into account.
You've been listening to a podcast from the series Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, a project bringing together experts from around the world and hosted here on the Wilson Centre's online digital archive at digitalarchive.org. These podcasts are part of the project The Global History of Sport in the Cold War, which is sponsored by the National Endowment of the Humanities, directed by Professor Bob Edelman of UC San Diego, Professor Chris Young from the University of Cambridge, and Dr. Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and run in collaboration with the German Historical Institute Moscow, the Jordan Centre for Advanced Russian Studies at New York University, and Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. The presenter is Vince Hunt, and the